Good afternoon. I'm just going to continue with my series on the 1987 World Championship match between Garry Kasparov, the reigning champion, who here has the black pieces, and Anatoly Karpov, the challenger, who has the white pieces. It was Karpov who took the lead in the match. Kasparov equalised. Karpov took the lead again in... I'll just check it. In the sixth game, Kasparov equalised, and eighth game, sorry, Kasparov equalised, and this is the 11th game. Yeah, okay. So d4, knight f6, controlling this square and this square, the most flexible answer to d4. Knight f6. Knight f6, c4, g6. The king's Indian defence, but it can turn into a Grunfeld if he plays d4 before the bishop or whatever. Knight comes c3 and he plays d5 before the bishop. So it becomes a Grunfeld. This is the exchange variation because they exchange the pawns, and the pawn comes to e4, threatening the knight, which is then taken. And white has established this powerful centre. Black has an active bishop pair, and he's going to take control of this file, this long diagonal, and look at playing moves like c5 to attack the centre. And so he attacks the centre first, and bishop comes to c4 and he plays c5. Obviously he can't take on c5 because bishop takes pawn. It's check and hits the rook and wins an exchange for black, so not playable. So he plays knight c2 to defend the pawn with the knight, because at the moment he's before he played the knight he was trying to play pawn takes pawn, pawn takes, queen takes, and then the bishop would be threatened, the rook would be threatened, the queen would be threatened, so he plays e2 to defend that. And Kasparov comes knight to c6 to attack it again. Bishop comes to e3 to defend it once more, so now it's attacked once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, defended 1, 2, 3, 4 times. So a lot of action and pressure concentrated on the d4 square. Both sides castle, and the bishop comes to g4, pinning one of the pieces which defends the d5 pawn. So the pawn comes to f3 to threaten the bishop, and the knight comes to a5 to threaten the bishop. This is actually a pawn sacrifice because it gives up black the opportunity to play white the opportunity to play bishop takes f7 check. Best move in chess according to my mate Ben Hunt from Chess Boot Camp, and I'm not disagreeing with him. He takes back, and now he takes the bishop on g4, and the rook takes and the king takes, and now he's got 3, 6, 7 against 3, 6, so he's a pawn up. Queen comes to d6, threatening the pawn on h2, sorry. So the king comes to g1. Yeah, and the queen comes to e6 to threaten the pawns on e4 and g4. Queen comes to d3 to attack the defend the pawn on e4. He's not bothered about pawn on g4 because he's still attacking this pawn. So a queen comes to c4, attacking the queen, this pawn, and the knight behind it. Yeah, the queen is taken, and the knight takes, threatening the bishop. Bishop comes to f2, and the pawn is taken. Pawn's taken, and he plays e5, giving his opponent a guarded pass pawn. Surely this is a huge advantage for white. You would think so, but it is very, very difficult to advance to d6 because it's covered by the knight. It can be covered by the bishop, and it can be covered by the rook, so probably not such a solid. But of course, he does go past and play the advanced pawn. And if we look at the analysis, excuse me, plus 0.32 for white. Not a huge advantage, as you might otherwise think, having this pass pawn guarded in the middle. Okay, so bishop comes to h6, threatening to come to e3 and swap off the bishop and attack the and then attack the pawn. He comes to h4, threatens to play g5 and cut off the bishop. So bishop comes to d2. Looks a bit crazy, but it's a good move, you know. It's defended there, and it can't be attacked so easily. So the rook attacks it, bishop comes to a5. So that he's covering now the d8 square, where the pawn would otherwise queen. The knight is threatened, and it gets defended by the pawn. The rook comes to c2, so that he's defending this pawn, and so that he's defending this square as well another time. Knight comes to d6, threatening the e4 pawn. If he wins that, yeah, he's a huge advantage. So the knight has to come to g3. The knight comes back to c4, and the pawn comes to g5. King comes towards the middle, and the knight goes to f1. Knight comes back to d6, threatening the pawn. Knight comes back to g3, and the knight comes to c4. It's not repetition of position because Karpov has played the pawn to g5, sorry, in the meantime. So the king comes to f1, the king comes to e7. Bishop comes to c5 check. Obviously it would be good if he could get himself here, but I think that is a bit dangerous. So he comes to f7, and the rook comes to f2 check. This would have been the danger with playing to d7, that the rook could come to e2 and then threaten to come to f7. Sorry, come anyway to f7, threatening to come to f2 and win the pawn. So yeah, king comes to g7, and the rook comes to f6. Bishop comes to b6. He really wants to swap off the bishops, and so that his knight can come here. And when it comes here, it's always guarded by the pawn, and makes an effective blockade for the pawn can be made on b6, on e7 with the knight supported by the rook, and then a pass pawn can be created on the queen side and should be winning chances. I think this was the mistake by Karpov. I think if we look at the analysis, it says -2 point. It says it was a blunder. It would be better to move the bishop out of the way. So, you know, if we go to move before that, if we go back a move, then we see that it's plus 0.76. That's a real blunder, and we'll find out why. Kasparov plays knight to e5. He's threatening the rook. Obviously, he can't move the rook here, it's covered. He can't move the rook here, it's covered. So wherever he moves the rook, he would then lose the bishop and be a whole piece down. So Instead, he elects to lose an exchange. The knight takes on c6, and you might think the obvious plan is to take the knight, but then the bishop will be taken, and you would rather preserve the bishop. So the bishop comes to c7, and the rook comes to f8, check. King comes to c2, and the rook comes to f7. This is no real danger because this knight will always be covering it. So the bishop comes to d6, and the rook comes to d7, providing more cover for the pawn. Bishop comes to c5, and the knight comes to a5, threatens to come in here and maybe establish a blockade here. Knight comes to f1, and the rook comes to c7, threatening the bishop. Bishop comes back to d6, and the rook comes to e2, c2 check, spying both of these pawns. This knight is still on its own enough to stop this pawn. So the king comes forward, and the rook takes the pawn, and the knight comes to e3 to defend the g2 pawn. King comes to f7 towards the center, and the knight threatens the pawn on e5. Knight comes c4 to threaten the bishop and defend the pawn. So he takes with check, and he takes with check, and he takes back. And now Kasparov is going to win this race. This pawn can't, it looks so powerful. These two passed pawns, supported by the bishop, but really the pieces are in the way for one another. So the bishop comes out of the way so that he's now threatened to come here, 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 and here, if he doesn't do anything to stop him. So the pawn comes forward, he's threatened to come to b2, in which case the bishop would have to take, and then he gets the bishop for nothing. Pawn comes forward, and he takes the pawn first. e8 check, and no. He didn't play king. Yeah, he did play king to e8. Is that right? Yeah, I'll look at the analysis. I think I was looking at. I wasn't so sure about the end, so I checked the analysis, and yeah, this is the wrong move. I was trying to weigh up between this and this, so I'm gonna remove that move. He didn't play that. Sorry, this was my analysis. I had to check why he didn't play that. He played king to f8, and then it's a win because he can stop the pawns by himself, and even if the king comes, then the pawn will get here, check, and the rook will stop these two pawns, and this pawn will win. The rook and king will stop these two pawns, and this pawn will get queen. So yeah. Okay, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Thanks. Bye.